Welcome to the Trent England Show. A little early this Thursday. I hope I'll see you later at the OCPA Citizenship Award Dinner. We're 25 years old. It's going to be a big party tonight, and if you miss that party, there's going to be another one up in Tulsa in the fall. So if you're not there tonight, you can join us at the Liberty Gala in Tulsa coming up later this year. We've got a great show this morning because Jami Lund is here. Jami is the senior policy analyst at the Freedom Foundation, former colleague of mine out on the West Coast. And so I'm really excited to have Jami here in Oklahoma talking with some policymakers here about labor unions. And Jami has been involved in the issue of public sector labor unions for a long time, both as a legislative staffer and as a think tank staffer at the Freedom Foundation, going back to the 1990s, which, you know, for a lot of our viewers, you know, now that we're on the, out there on the internet, not just the old radio waves, for a lot of our viewers in the 90s, that's like history book stuff, right? And for others of our viewers, they remember it all very well. But Jami, tell us, I wanted to give folks, since most of our viewers and listeners are in Oklahoma, and it's a little different here, I want to give them a view of how the government labor union racket works in states where they really have full control. Because frankly, I mean, I used to live there, and I'm still shocked. Before we went on the air here, you were describing some of the things that they've done. These aren't granddad's unions. Right. How does explain the basic racket to folks?
Well, and one of the key differences is the public sector labor organization is nothing like a private sector labor organization. In the private sector model, you've got this idea that there are these money-grubbing profiteers who are going to take advantage of workers, who are going to make things unsafe, and that a unified worker's voice is able to sort of balance that out. And okay, now we've got this give and take a little bit that goes on. But in the government side, that's not at all true. There's no profit motive in government. There's nobody who gets richer as a result of somehow taking advantage of public employees. There's no history of exploitation of public employees. If anything, you look at the job applications that come in on the public side, and they're very high demand positions with reliability. They have civil service protections as far as you can't, be fired without cause and all of the rest of that, independent of whether you're in a union or not. And you certainly don't have the same dynamic as far as safety or the rest of that. So, but what happens is labor organizations are financial enterprises. They make money selling a particular service. And so when it comes to the public sector side, they say, well, here's a bunch of people who are well paid, who we think we could help them do even better if they would just give us 1.5% of their income, or 1.7 or 3% or whatever they happen to charge for dues. But we need a little help with that. We need the government to require the employer to let these people be in a group together, and then to make everybody be in that group where we get to be their voice and we get to charge them for being that voice for them. Then we get to negotiate with the state or with a school district or a city or a county or whatever about how much people get paid and how things are done and all of that. So that's what's significantly different. So you've got this money-making financial enterprise which gets this monopoly franchise to deliver a service to folks that they may not want, and to charge whatever they want, to use the money however they want, without any of the usual consumer protections applying or antitrust provisions applying. So it's a dream financial enterprise as far as that goes. And on the public sector side, there's not even like an opponent.
Yeah, that's what I wanted to ask about, because the negotiation piece of this is fascinating. You mentioned, the classic private sector union idea that you've got some, you got a capitalist over here and you've got labor over here, and the capitalist is one person or at least one company, and labor is all fractured, so you've got to pull labor together so that you've got one voice versus one voice, and there's this natural tension,
sure,
sometimes opposition, but just, there are different interests. And the government bargaining table is totally different, right?
Absolutely, because it's intrinsically political. I mean, at the end of the day, the best investment that a government union can make is buying politicians, because that's who you negotiate opposite. That's who makes the decisions about the budget. That's who makes the decisions about the revenue, the taxes that are going to be charged. And so rather than, combat on a fair footing, why not go out and by 3 school board members, or by 7 city council members.
But Jami, buying politicians. That sounds.
That doesn't happen.
I'm going to ask a question to which I know the answer, which is, how much do unions really, in your state, Washington State,
Sure.
my original home state, how much are unions really involved in politics?
Right, and the unions will tell you, well, we hardly ever get involved in politics, and politics is just a fraction, a tiny piece of what we do. But on the government union side, it is central to what they do. It is their core mission to make sure that the people making decisions about all of the policies of a state or a city or a school district are interested in making the union successful financially. And in the state of Washington, we've done the analysis of how unions are involved in elections. And when they say we don't use any money for politics, what they mean is we don't use that much money and hand it to a politician. But there are many, many ways of influencing culture and elections that are not technically handing money to a politician. If you're in a union, you'll know that you get 5, 6, 7, 8, 12 mail pieces, phone calls related to the election. All correspondence from a union to a union member is not a political contribution. That's just as educating you about the best choice that you could make in this upcoming election, because it affects you.
Well, and on the money side, it's big money, right?
It's millions of dollars. Our governor received $5.8 million from labor organizations to get into office. There's no way that Jay Inslee would be in office except that labor organizations decided we're going to make sure that everybody who teaches a child how to read helps us get this guy into office so that he can make the decisions about who's on the Public Employment Relations Commission and all of these other decisions which impact what goes on at the bargaining table.
I guess just to drive it home for folks, this is not, so they gather around a bargaining table, literally people who work for these unions and politicians to whom they've at least written checks, and some of these politicians literally owe their office to the unions. It's not really even a bargaining table.
Right. Who's representing the taxpayer at a bargaining table where our governor, Jay Inslee, received $1.8 million, I think, from SEIU, and he's going to negotiate with SEIU how much the taxpayers are going to pay. And by the way, 3% of all the money that changes hands in that exchange goes to the SEIU's coffers so that they can invest in the next election.
And let's talk a little more about that, because all this might sound, look, this is how it works in California, Oregon, Washington, New York, a lot of states around the country, and a lot of that money gets invested in politics even outside of those states, even here in Oklahoma. We've seen some of that money being spent in Oklahoma just over the last few weeks. We're going to get to that in a minute. But if all of that sounds crazy, and if people are starting to think, hey, maybe that FDR guy was right when he said we should never go down this road of public sector unions, talk about the dues skimming, because this is even worse. I think this is just so morally reprehensible, the way the SEIU skims money. Oh, well, you explain it, though.
Right. Well, as far as there are kinds of quasi-public employees, and honestly, if you think of a public sector labor organization as a business that collects dues, that's what they do, then what they do makes sense. They look sideways and they say, well, where else can we collect dues? And for instance, the auto workers decided that things weren't going well in the auto industry. How do we keep our dues coming in the door? So they said, who's really been exploited lately that we could maybe help are graduate students. And so they set out to unionize graduate students. Well, graduate students who take a teaching assistant position, they're grateful for the position. They get involved in their academic area. Nobody's ever thought that they were an exploited group of employees. And they've thought, the experience I'm getting, the resume ad, this helps my future immensely. But to the auto workers, it's like, well, we're losing auto workers. We could maybe grab some of these guys' money. And by the way, they move out every 2 years. So how do you vote out a union when you're not even going to be there for more than 2 years in graduate school, or 4? But
or 5 or 6, but still.
But they choose to do that. And what happened with home health care providers in Washington State, and California, Oregon, a number of other states,
Illinois.
They've decided, hey, people are getting paid to look after the needs of loved ones who have a disability of some sort. It keeps them out of public institutions. Let's make that investment, and the federal government has. The union said, well, if money is going from the public sector to people, well, that's kind of like a paycheck, even though it's like a stipend. It was never thought of as like your punch and clock for the government. It's, we're going to reimburse you some of your costs of caring for a family member or somebody who would otherwise be in an institution. So they paid $2 million in Washington State to buy an initiative which would help old people. Well, who's against that?
Yeah.
And the fine print of it is, oh, and by the way, we're going to unionize all of these people who've never met each other, who are independent I mean, they're independent contractors, really. They're self-employed, and now they're suddenly all part of a union. And they don't even have to pay them because, of course, they're taking the money right out of the state, too.
In Oklahoma, we call this a state question. They put this on the ballot. And if I remember right, it also had some training things. It sounded like it was all about...
Yeah, there were pieces of it.
Making sure people who took care of the elderly were well-trained.
Right.
But really, it was about extracting money that was traveling from the federal government through the state government to people taking care of their kids or their siblings or what have you.
Right. And the SEIU then, for the money they take, and they set their dues because there's no laws that restrict, you know, how badly you can exploit this amazing windfall. They set their dues at 3%. And they have no responsibility for it because there's no workplace, there's no grievances, there's no helping somebody with a discipline issue. I mean, there's none of the usual union work, but you're collecting double the union dues amount from people who probably get next to nothing in many cases. And all you have to do is meet with your buddy, the governor that you helped elect, every 2 years and decide how much more the state should be paying for this service. Yeah. And so it's really it's quite a boondoggle all the way around. But to be skimming 3% off of all the Medicaid money so that these guys can make money and then invest in elections. And money that's given in those circumstances has less of the usual accountability. Like in Washington State, you see some really crazy policies you see people protesting, you know, McDonald's, or you see talk about rent control or talk about the $15 minimum wage. Well, that is not something that people would normally write, hey, I think that we should, you know, really make it illegal for people to be less valuable than $15, we're going to ban that, so we're going to pass a law. You wouldn't write a check for that. But if your union dues are paying for it, so the more extreme the cause is, the more likely that it is wholly dependent upon labor organizations, because these guys are ideologues that can sort of experiment in things that would never have common support if they had to compete in the true marketplace of ideas.
And here in Oklahoma, I think a lot of people are still shocked. I know some legislators are still shocked that there was a huge pay raise passed for teachers, bigger than the Oklahoma Education Association actually asked for in their initial demands. They wanted $6,000. The legislature said, we'll give you $6,100 as an average raise. And then the OEA shut down schools after that happened. I think a lot of people look at that and say, well, wait a second, this doesn't make any sense. You know, why is the OEA so intransigent, so inflexible? And you have a pretty good explanation for this that relates to some Supreme Court cases that kind of started, I think, because unions had pushed these dues rackets so far. Describe this Janus case. I mean, right now the Supreme Court's deliberating over this. How did we get to this point where we might actually have a major earthquake in
Well, the first thing I want to
labor?
ask a little bit more about is, how expensive is it to do something like we just saw done? I mean, how much advertising, how much, you know, buses driving people around and food service and marketing, and I mean, there had to have been a tremendous amount of money spent to make that happen. We know people don't just spontaneously do stuff. They've got to be urged and urged and urged, and got to make it easy, and you got to do all of this stuff. There have to have been tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars spent to generate the kind of activity that we saw. Where did that money come from, and who wrote the check for that, and why did they choose to do that? I mean, as the root of your question, and when I saw this happening in Oklahoma, and one of the reasons that I was interested in talking to you about it, I realized the Supreme Court right now is hearing a case, or heard a case earlier this year, which is considering the whole question of forcing people to pay for a union. And on the government union side, the challenge is, some union members say, or union represented workers say, listen, I don't really believe in what this group is doing. I think that I have an obligation to my employer that I sign in my own contract, but I don't need these people to speak for me. I don't agree with what they want to do. I don't like the idea of shutting down my workplace. I believe in educating kids or whatever the cause is. And they went to the Supreme Court to say, isn't it a violation of my freedom of speech to be forced to say all of the things that these people over here who don't share my views at all are making me say with the money they're taking from me? And the court is poised to agree that that is in fact a violation of the free speech of those folks, to force them to talk. And so What the unions counter to that is they come to the court and they say, oh, but court, it's in the interest of labor peace to have labor organizations balancing the private sector, balancing the management. And these are arguments that are left over from the private sector discussion of the topic. And they say labor peace requires that unions be healthy and that they thrive and that everybody pay for the service that they're getting from the union. And so the reason that you should require people to pay is in the interest of labor peace.
Which if I could just chime in, as a law student, when I first read a case like this, it's a little bit shocking to read people going before a court and saying, you need to give us special powers or else we're going to cause riots. I mean
right.
that's what a lot of these labor union cases sort of boil down to. At least on the private sector side, you do have these laws that sort of, that at least pretend to, and I think in some cases really do say, well, we're going to constrain how management works, we're going to constrain how the labor unions work, and we're going to set up this paradigm that people can opt into to resolve these disputes so they don't spill out into the streets. And there's some rationale. It's a lot different when you've got, a group of police officers or a group of teachers saying, well, that's a nice civil society you've got there. Be a shame if we ruined it.
Right.
So you better give us,
make sure that we get paid and you'll have peace.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
And especially when, as FDR pointed out, the teacher, the police officer gets to go to the polls and vote for the people who run government just like everybody else, and that's supposed to be how the system works.
Sure. And the other thing that I would point out on the public sector side that is not true in the private sector side is you don't have a choice. Government is by definition a monopoly, and by definition a monopoly that uses force. So when it comes to paying taxes, you don't get to protest by not paying, because we will bring people with guns to deal with that.
Yeah, there's no boycott strategy.
Right, you don't get to boycott your taxes if you're dissatisfied with the terms of your tax payment arrangement.
Sorry to some of my really libertarian viewers out there, they still are flirting with that idea.
But nonetheless, in the current practice, people with guns will show up if you stop paying your taxes and take your property or deal with you accordingly, bring you before somebody is going to talk to you about that. And also with students. Students don't get to not go to school if they're dissatisfied with the product. Parents don't get to, decide that we are not going to serve the public interest or whatever. But why is it then that the employee who's delivering a constitutionally guaranteed service that is a monopoly, that is enforced by force, why do they get to decide, I know I signed a contract which said I would show up and deliver this service, but I'm not going to do it, and I'm not going to let anybody else do it. I'm not going to allow this constitutional service to be provided. In the government sector, take it with police, it makes, it's really clear why you don't have strikes with police. It's so important that we don't allow that to happen, and that's what's going on here. So what I think is going on as far as why now, why after this huge pay raise do you suddenly have buses driving people in to protest and all of this incredibly expensive marketing campaign on teacher pay? And I really think that the union's argument in court was labor peace requires it. Well, the fact is, in a state where teachers have options, where public employees have options, you don't have strikes. It just doesn't happen. I'm sure you would have no history of strikes here. Now in Washington,
not since Right to Work. Yeah.
Ironically, in Washington, we have them regularly. It's like a seasonal. Somebody is going to get chosen for strikes every year, and so I really think that what you've got going on here, and the NEA's attorney, chief counsel, admitted this in speeches, saying, look, there's going to be labor unrest in right-to-work states because that's how we demonstrate that the court needs to rule to give us the money. So it sort of is, your windows are going to get broken, particularly in right-to-work states. And if you look at the states that have had this happen, West Virginia, they're looking at Virginia. You've got all of this,
Kentucky, Arizona.
This unprecedented agitation going on, funded agitation in specific states that are right-to-work, while the Supreme Court has heard the argument and will be ruling in June on the subject. So I imagine after the ruling it'll all go away again, because no point to be made, no reason to drag people in by buses.
The justices are right now working on the opinions in that case, where the union said, because if they decide in favor of the worker Janus in this case, all states become like Oklahoma, like Arizona when it comes to these unions, and the union argument was, that'll lead to disasters, and suddenly, while the Supreme Court's deliberating this case, they've tried to make these cases
to create the very disasters that they suggest, which is ironic because those disasters only happen in forced fee states like Washington and California and whatnot.
On a regular basis.
On a regular basis.
But they don't get nearly the national play that we've seen this year.
I mean, they get, right, and a part of it is the investment is coming from Washington, D.C. on this issue, on this agitation, and what they're buying is the marketing opportunity nationwide. So you are getting the coverage that's different than you would otherwise get, because that's what they're buying with dues money.
And this isn't, I mean, this is not an explanation, because I know we have people who watch who are frustrated parents or frustrated teachers, and I mean, this isn't an explanation for why. We're not claiming that teachers themselves are frustrated because the NEA told them to be. But I think even the savvy teachers who were involved in the walkout have to understand that there are powerful political forces that were pushing resources into that were lining all of that up, and it's a big part of the explanation for why it happened after the pay raise. I mean,
and that's what was fascinating to see is like, why are we out now? We just got this huge pay raise. So.
Yeah. And I mean, I'll say, I've said it before, I mean, they did, and I think this comes from the NEA because they're, they have a lot of money to do sophisticated messaging. They did an amazing job pivoting to say, well, teacher pay is really not that important. It's actually desks and books and some other thing, right?
Right, yeah.
And it was very sophisticated how they did that very quickly. So Jami, what happens nationally, assuming Janus goes the way that most people think it's going to go? Public sector workers nationwide will all of a sudden not be subject to being fired if they don't pay union dues. They'll have the right to work and choose to be a part of a union or not. What happens? I mean, how big of a deal is that?
And again, starting out saying these are very well-funded, sophisticated financial enterprises, and their ability to collect money is their top priority. And so this is truly ground zero for them. Now, I don't think it's going to have a devastating effect on, I don't think everybody's going to quit the union or anything like that. There are services that are provided by the union that many people find very valuable, and it is useful for them to belong, and they choose to do that, and they will continue to do that. But for the union, it's like not missing a trick in a card game. They want every dollar that is potentially out there. And so we are seeing in Washington, where some of these things have happened already with those home health care providers, there are a number of steps that can be taken to make sure the cash flow is intact. And keeping the cash flow intact is right. So right now in Washington, they're having people who have the right to work in these things that are impending sign irrevocable membership cards. So you may only cancel your membership during a 10-day window, which appears 45 days prior to the anniversary of the date that you signed the card. I mean, it's like if any business did this, it would definitely be an unfair. It would be a Consumer Protection Act violation.
If the union loses government's power to sort of compel people or twist people's arms, all of a sudden they're gonna go back to the old record club, the old CD club model.
It'll be like a phone plan or something like that. Like you can get in, but you can't get out. And
Hotel California.
Yes, it's a Hotel California dues collection scheme. So we see them transferring to that. In our state, they passed a law to mandate that all new employees get a half-hour public paid union sales pitch meeting. So the public is now paying for a union sales pitch meeting for a half hour for every new employee in every position that is unionized.
So you got the record club and the timeshare.
And you've got the timeshare pitch, and and that's by mandate and state funded. In Washington, they're also making sure they're very unhappy about the Freedom Foundation telling people what their rights are, letting people know that they can opt out. We have a website, optouttoday.com, which will actually also give you some Oklahoma opt-out opportunities as well. We'll be there shortly. They don't like that, so they're making it illegal for us to get the names of people who are public employees or attempting to, and so that's been an issue. So it's all about protecting the cash flow, because that really is job one.
Jami Lund with the Freedom Foundation, thanks so much for being on the Trent England Show today.
Absolutely, it's been a pleasure.
And of course, you can subscribe on iTunes, YouTube, Facebook, SoundCloud. Visit the whole archive at ocpathink.org, and where we're going to be pushing out some big upgrades to the website next week. You'll want to definitely check in on that. And in next week as well, we have a charter school entrepreneur who's going to be with me next Wednesday. So that's a big show coming up. Thanks so much for watching the Trent England Show. We'll be back one more day tomorrow.